What is good people? You are now listening to a very special episode of, well, At the Plate and Since We Last Spoke. I'm going off script for this episode because this is a very special episode to me. On January 13th, 2023, I released my first episode officially of At the Plate with Danny Foxworth. And when you hear this recording, it will be a year officially in this podcast game. Man, I don't know where to begin. I'll begin in 2020/2021. I was making my rounds as far as guest appearances on podcasts, and I was getting a lot of good feedback from my appearances. And eventually people started asking me, so, yo, Danny, when you gonna start your own podcast? And I would just brush it off and be dismissive, like, man, I'm not doing that. That's not on my mind. I'm just here to, just to run out the bullpen whenever they call the lefty out. So, excuse me. Over time, the more guest appearances I did, the more that podcast it started to come to the surface. And it was on my guest appearance on Beyond the Art with Brandon Silver's podcast, which make sure y'all check that out. My mind was made up that I was going to start my own podcast, and I put those proclamations out into the universe on his episode that we did back in September of 2022. And I said I was going to do a baseball podcast because, especially in the Black podcast universe, you got football and basketball podcasts, and you got gender roles and relationship podcasts. And I feel like that's just, we're packed to the gills with people doing that kind of content. There's like 6 trillion podcasts you can find where you can get that kind of content. But I wanted to give something different or provide something different, put in paint where it ain't, basically. And it wasn't until I got on Twitter and was scrolling down my Twitter timeline and seeing how many other Black folks enjoy baseball as much as I do. And the light bulb went off in my head. And I'm like, that might be my lane right there. And then when I started realizing how many people root for different baseball teams, I'm like, oh, this is my lane for real right here. So after I made my proclamation on Brandon's podcast, I started reaching out to all these people on Twitter. I'm like, oh, I'm going to start a podcast and I would love to have you on as a guest so we could chop it up about your favorite team. And everybody said, yeah, let's do it. And so the wheels slowly started to go in a forward motion. And I started buying podcast equipment and, taking this room that I'm currently in and removing the beds and stuff out of it and turning that into my studio, so to speak, or as I call it, my spaceship, and just brick by brick, piece by piece, putting everything together. And on January, well, actually, I dropped a preview episode just to let people know what I was doing. And then on January 13th, I dropped the pilot episode entitled Number 6 in Your Programs, Number 1 in Your Hearts, where I basically talk about how my love of baseball started and my brief stint in playing Little League Baseball for the Moncks Corner Rec Department, and also how I became a fan of the Texas Rangers. And when I released that episode, I was like, wow, it's official now. I'm a podcaster. Man, I gotta keep this thing going. And I started getting a lot of positive feedback from my people and from fellow podcasters. And that really gave me a good feeling. I'm like, all right, I think I'm on the right track. So eventually, the people that I reached out to be guests, I started doing episodes with them. And I'm always excited whenever we're corresponding, and then they send me the email, and then I send them the link, and I'm like, all right, we putting the wheels in motion. This is actually about to happen. I love that process of just getting everything together and making sure that everything is running smooth, and then we knock an episode out, and it's just and after I hit the stop button, and I'm just like, man, I'm so thankful that this person took time out of their day to talk to me about my favorite sport, and they didn't have to do that. And I'm extremely grateful for all of these guests, and I'm gonna run these guests down because they need to they need to know that they're greatly appreciated. So my first guest was the homie Gerard Droz, and I was talking about all the podcast appearances that I was on. A lot of them were on his podcast, which is the Board Meeting podcast, and we talked about the Atlanta Braves and him talking about that Sid Bream slide in the '92 NLCS and just bringing back so many memories. Then the next episode, the aforementioned Brandon Silvers, I had him on to talk about the Dodgers and how he became a Dodgers fan because Magic Johnson became part owner of the Dodgers, and he was a big Lakers fan. So seeing that how Magic tied into his decision to root for the Dodgers is fascinating to hear. Then also next episode, I had my man Priest Jacobs. The episode was called "Searching for Buck O'Neill," and great episode. We talked about the Negro League and how Kurt Flood was a game changer and is the godfather of free agency, and a whole bunch of other enlightening topics enlightening baseball tidbits that I was not privy to. Then, of course, my first female guest, but one of my favorite guests. I think I've had her on the most. I think she's pretty much has the most guest appearances on the podcast. Got to shout out Nick Jew. Talked all things Oakland A's baseball and how sitting next to Dave Stewart at a game and talking with him led her to becoming a fan of the Oakland A's. That was such a fascinating listen. I always enjoy hearing how people became fans of the teams that they became a fan of, and her story was one that I truly dug. I mean, you got to meet Dave Stewart. Come on, man. He was one of my favorite pitchers growing up. I mean, that stare down at the mound. I mean, it gets no better than that. Then my dog 12 Kyle, another one of my favorite podcasters. He's the host of the 12 Kyle podcast. And I reached out to him because I knew he was a Yankees fan. I was like, man, I'd love to have you on the pod. And he's like, let's do it. So it was super dope podcast. Great episode. And I enjoyed hearing his perspective of being a Yankees fan and him talking about, growing up in Florence, South Carolina, and, seeing the Mets all the time, but he still became a fan of the Yankees. And he mentioned WWOR, which just brought back so many memories. Watching Mets games on that station. We had a satellite dish growing up. So, yeah, took a trip down memory lane. And then the next dude, my dog Mo from We're Just the Messengers podcast. I had to get a Charleston guest on here, and we chopped it up about the Braves, no pun intended. And it was dope hearing his story about how him and his brother would go to Atlanta in the summer, in the summer of '95 and '96, and the pops would take him to Braves games, and that's how he became a fan of the Braves. And then next episode, my man K Bad, this is probably one of the most downloaded episodes is Murray's mustache, and we got into it about him rooting for the Orioles and how his father laughed at Brady Anderson hitting all these home runs, and his father's like, dog, everybody knows he's juicing, and he's just like dying laughing at the fact that he's just abusing his privilege of taking steroids, and he saw right through that. And it was super, super great episode. And talking about Murder by UGK would be in his walk-up music if he were a baseball player, which, I mean, excellent choice. If I told you cocaine numbers, you would think I was lying. Then the next episode, I got his co-host, my man Tone, TKO from the Firestarter podcast. And we talked about all things New York Mets. And that was another great episode. And hearing how him and K-Bad and Ba got together and formed the Firestarter podcast, which is honestly, Firestarter podcast that's my all-time favorite podcast. And I'll get into that later. Then the following episode, Michael Jai Griffey Jr. featuring my man Tim Hall, Seattle, Washington, film critic. We talked about him, how he got into the world of film reviewing, and then we got into his early days growing up in the Bay and rooting for the Oakland A's, and eventually moving to Seattle and becoming a Mariners fan. Always a good time chopping it up with him. And then had another South Carolina guest on the next episode, my man Ced Warren. He's been on twice now. Yeah. And we also talked about the Atlanta Braves and him playing high school baseball. And I love how he succinctly used baseball as a your plate approach as a metaphor for life at the end of the episode. That was super dope. And then can't forget my dog Black Rob. Took it out west. He's San Diego born and raised. And we got to talk about all things San Diego Padres and how he also played high school baseball and how reading Tony Gwynn's book helped improve his approach at the plate as well. And then had my man Drop Top Doc from the Lack of Institutional Control podcast. Make sure y'all check them out. This is great podcast talking about college football. He's born and raised in the South Side of Chicago, so we talked all things White Sox. And then my homie Jay Braves, he'd never done a podcast before. Saw on Twitter that he's a Cincinnati Reds fan, so I reached out to him. I'm like, dog, I gotta have you on the podcast, and he agreed, and we had a great time talking about all things Cincinnati Reds. His favorite player is Barry Larkin, and he talked about being a little league coach for an incoming UNC player, Drake Powell, and talking about our days playing little league baseball. Great episode. And then the next guy, my dude Bombastic from the OKP message boards. I mean, I can't say enough about this man. He is Philly to the blood, bones, and chromosomes. And we talked about all things Philadelphia Phillies. Talked about Mariano Duncan and John Kruk and my man Darren Dalton, Lenny Dykstra. Man, we even brought up Juan Samuel, that wet ass Jerry curl he used to have. And he's also got a great podcast called The Bombcast, DABOMB cast. You make sure y'all check them out on SoundCloud. And then reached out to my guy DJ Ambush, another guy from Columbia, and we reminisced on the old baseball days in Columbia when you had the Capital City Bombers and you had the Columbia Mets, and catching games at Sarge Fry Field and talking about his favorite players, especially the slick fielding prowess of one Omar Vizquel. Always have fun chopping it up with him. And then got to shout out my dog Reese. He's one half of the Shoot from the Hip show. He's H-Town born and raised, so we had to get some Astros talk in and talking about our favorite players and how, even as a Texas Rangers fan, I always enjoyed seeing Jose Altuve play. And he talked about him and Yordan Alvarez and his favorite Astros moments. Then got to shout out my dog Jamboy. He never disappoints. If you know him, if you listen to the Firestarter podcast, this man is emailer public enemy number one. And I had to get him on the pod to talk about the Yankees. And yeah, once he gets going, it's hard to get him to stop. So I had to sit back. I had to fall back and let that man get his words off, man. And it was nothing short of entertaining. So that's another one of the most highly downloaded episodes as well. And then the next episode, which was special to me because this guy, Zoe, brilliant producer, musical arranger. Man, I've listened to his podcast. I'm such a huge fan of his music, but it wasn't until I listened to one of his podcasts and I realized I knew he was from Detroit, but I didn't real and I knew he was a Tigers fan. But what I didn't know was the fact that he actually played college baseball at Western Kentucky. So when I reached out to him, I was like, I do a baseball podcast, and I'd love to have you on. And he's responded back like, dude, I would be honored. He was like, let's do it because he was like, I literally never get to talk about baseball ever. Every time I'm on a podcast, it's always about the music. So we got to talk baseball with him. And I didn't realize that he was also drafted by the Blue Jays out of high school. So a lot of interesting tidbits of information that I didn't know about this guy. Another great episode. Then my man Eldon Hawks, the man, the voice, the fragrance, host of the Webster Style podcast. Man, he's from Baltimore, so we talked all things Orioles, and hearing him speak on being at staying at his great grandfather's house, and his great grandfather always sitting at the table and listening to Orioles games like every single day, and how that became the catalyst for him rooting for the Birds. Another great episode. And then my man, the Abstract, had him on to talk all things Kansas City Royals. He's from all over. He's from the Mississippi Delta, but he's currently residing in Kansas. So spent a lot of time going to Royals games, and we got to talk about the late great Mr. Buck O'Neil and how one of my biggest regrets in life is not getting a picture taken with Mr. Buck O'Neil. I got to meet him at a Kansas City Royals game, and like, gosh, this was like 2003. And then we go back to the Mets. My dog Rick, my Tar Heel brother in Christ. I had him on, and we talked about everything from doing chiropractor work to how he became a Mets fan, and just him being such a big fan of Doc Gooden. And we talked about him. We talked about Ron Darling, Howard Johnson, all kinds of Mets players, all kinds. And another great episode. Shout out to Rick, and shout out to my man Bushrod. He's probably the OG Firestarter podcast listener, and he's from Compton, born and raised. So we got to talk about all things LA Dodgers and how he met one of his favorite Dodger players. His name escapes me, but he came to visit his some family members that lived in his neighborhood, and how he met him, and that's how he hitched his wagon to the LA Dodgers. And then he moved to Dallas and took on the Rangers as a secondary team, so to speak. So we got to talk a little Rangers with him too. So that was awesome. Then put out some solo episodes just chronicling the ups and downs with the Texas Rangers and what they were going through, whether they were on a skid or whether they were on a winning streak, and just documenting that and just living and breathing and dying with this team throughout the course of the year. But it got better towards the end of the year. I'll get into that later. And also, I did a special episode dedicating the episode to my home team, which is the Charleston River Dogs, and before that, it was the Charleston Rainbows. Just gave a little brief history of professional baseball in the city of Charleston. Then I had my man Big Todd. He is one half of the Baseless Banter podcast. He's from DC. He's a Washington Nationals fan. So we talked about all things Washington Nationals. Great time with him. Then brought another special lady on the podcast. Jade, she is part of the Rasslecast, and she also is from the South Side of Chicago. So we talked all things White Sox, and how she talked about going to White Sox games with her father when she was a kid. And whenever she comes home, that they still keep that tradition alive. And even though her mom isn't really into sports like that, sometimes she'll tag along with them too. And then my man Retro Rob, he's from Sacramento, but I think he grew up in Arizona, and he's a big Cleveland Indians / Guardians fan. And interesting story about recording this. We tried to come to an agreement on a recording time, and his was a little is slightly inconvenient for me, but I made it work. We recorded at like 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That was the only time he could record. So what I did was I told my boss that I had a doctor's appointment. She was like, okay, cool. So 2 o'clock, instead of going to the doctor, I left I left work and came straight home and knocked this episode out with him and went back to work. And hearing how he became an Indians fan because he lived in the town in Arizona where they held their spring training games, and talking about Sandy Alomar and Roberto Alomar and Carlos Baerga, who were also former Charleston Rainbows players. And my first memories of Roberto Alomar was going on a field trip to a Charleston Rainbows game to see him play second base. This was like back in '87. Then the aforementioned Ced Warren, I brought him back on and we did an MLB playoff preview. And our World Series picks were not at all what we predicted, but it was always great talking baseball with that guy. And then the homie Damien, aka Velvet Jones, had to get him on. We talked all things California Angels. He's out in LA. And it was so funny hearing him talk about how he became a fan of the Angels. He said flat out, the tickets were cheap. So I can sit in the outfield for like $8 and watch Mike Trout and Shohei Ohtani lose for $8. He's like, I don't feel too bad about that. I'm like, hey, good enough reason for me. Then finally, I was able to get a fellow Texas Rangers fan on here. Shout out to Just Becky. I actually had her on here twice because that's when the Rangers started their red hot run into the playoffs. And talking about watching Rangers games with her dad and talking about our favorite Rangers moments and our favorite players. Great episode. And then, of course, I had to bring it back on when the Rangers won the world title and we got a chance to celebrate. And that was awesome. And then after that, had a friend of the podcast, Brandon Silvers, had him back on. Him and his partner, Brett Gosnell, his podcast partner. And we talked about the MLB season wrap up and just like surprises, disappointments, MVP picks, who we thought was going to win the Cy Young. It's always great chopping it up with those dudes. And my man, KP, aka Fry Drexler, he really took it back. He's originally from H-Town, and we really got to go way back with the Houston Astros and how like he used to go to games for like dirt cheap. He said they would go to roughly three or four games a week because the tickets were so cheap. And his story of his great grandmother getting to meet J.R. Richard and how he had a connect in the neighborhood, and he was able to get J.R. Richard to show up to her house and sign her J.R. Richard doll that she got in an Astros game. And him getting to actually sit on the porch and talk with his great grandmother. Really good story. And J.R. Richard, he's a little before my time, but he was always just imposing figure, black pitcher. He was like 6'8". And every time Nolan Ryan talked about great pitchers, he always made mention of J.R. Richard. So it was great to hear those. It's always good to hear those kind of stories from a local perspective, so to speak. And then my homie Damian Jackson, brought him on, and we talked all things Atlanta Braves. He's ATL to the core. And we got to talk about him actually working at Fulton County Stadium and getting to witness a lot of the great Braves moments in person, being an employee at Fulton County Stadium. And then, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the great Shakia Taylor, sports writer for the Shot Tribune. And we talked about, her growing up, going to Carolina Mudcats games when she lived in North Carolina, which then she moved to Ohio and became a Cleveland Indians fan. And then talking about, players that we grew up watching, and Skyline Chili, and her disdain for Skyline Chili, and talking about the greatness that is Ellie De La Cruz. And I'm not going to lie, she's the one that really got me on the Ellie De La Cruz hype train. Her and Jay Braves. So big shout out to Shakia. And then my Carolina brother in Christ, Antoine Hardy, aka Slang Dini, talking about growing up rooting for the Mets, growing up in Kinston, North Carolina, and watching Doc Gooden and Darryl Strawberry, and how my leg kick, his patented leg kick, there's the same move that I used when I was playing baseball. And we got to talk about, how LL Cool J is unhinged, like more than he should be, and how that him being unhinged was a good advantage for him. So yeah, those were the guests that I had on At the Plate, and I'm looking forward to talking to more guests and putting out more episodes, because this has been so much fun. It's been so much fun. It's almost, to me, this is like a social project for me, because if you know me in real life, you know that I'm naturally introverted. I don't do small talk at all. And the fact that I get to talk to people that I have a genuine interest in, and getting to hear perspectives from them, and getting to hear about what makes them tick. That's always been a treat for me. But my other podcast, since we last spoke, I dropped my first episode of that on January 17th of 2023. And with this podcast, again, I just wanted to talk about things that weren't necessarily being talked about a great deal. And also talking about me, just sharing, like bringing you into my world a little bit more, but also having guests on to talk about different topics as well. So I remember the first episode. I mean, I'm talking about, I talked about getting a colonoscopy and what that was like. You know, talking about losing my grandmother and how important crying is, and talking about, just childhood stories episodes, talking about how I thought when LL Cool J said, eat Cool J cookies, that he actually had Cool J cookies out, and my grandfather being confused at my anger that Cool J cookies weren't a real thing. And having Gerard Rose and his homie Mike from the Board Meeting podcast on, and I started doing some tournament style episodes. So we did a snack chips tournament style episode. We did a fast food French fries tournament episode. We did a Wu-Tang solo bracket tournament episode. And also with tournament episodes, I did another one of the most downloaded episodes was the Real World cast members tournament episode that I did with Nick Jew and another guest, Bridget, which I had her on the podcast. We had a very good talk about dealing with anxiety and the ways that anxiety manifests itself, and the ways that we treat that anxiety, like through meditation, through therapy, through exercise. I mean, it was very, very, very good episode. And that was another one of the highest rated, well, one of the most downloaded episodes. And then having my mom on for the Mother's Day episode and my father on for the Father's Day episode. And hearing things from them about their upbringing that I knew nothing about. I mean, I'm 43 and I'm still learning new things from about my parents, and very good conversations. And then hearing each other's perspective of how they met and talking about when they got married and talking about fatherhood, and just awesome episodes. Then have to get a shout out to my girl Clara and her talking about how she grew up in Charleston and then how she moved from place to place, and eventually she went back to school and got her degree, and then how God showed her to get into theology, and the process behind that was a super fascinating listen. Make sure y'all check that episode out. It's called Pursue, Fail, and Joy. And then had my girl Aisha on. She's from Monetta, South Carolina, and she talked about how she got into singing in the church, and then when she moved to Charleston, and how her filling in for a sick lead singer who fell ill for a gig, and then she took her place, and how that got her noticed, and she started doing more singing gigs around the city. And got to give a shout out to my dog Infrared Crypto. He's the man responsible for the intro and outro music for my podcast, and it would be in bad taste for me to not have him on and talk about his production process, and talking about who his influences are, and we got to talk about our favorite Neptune songs. And again, always enjoy talking with him. And he works for Under Armour. He actually does like color design for Under Armour with the sneakers for NBA players. When we got to talk about that, it's very fascinating. Then my man Jay Scott, we talked about all things Atlanta with him. He's Atlanta born and raised, and how he talked about going back and forth from Atlanta to Chicago in the summertime because he has family out there that he would visit. And it's always cool whenever I can talk to somebody about sports and we can get into a passionate discussion about battle rap as well. Super good episode. Next episode, my man Orangeburg Slim. Got to shout him out. Super dope photographer based out of Orangeburg. He's doing some just great things with photography. He's got his own clothing line. This is a Sable Palm Company. Make sure y'all check him out. Always good. I got to get him back on the pod too, because he's doing some amazing things. Then another one of my favorite episodes was with one of my high school classmates, Yusha Gilmore, who is the reason why I became it was the reason why I fell in love with women's basketball. She actually went from high school to playing at Rutgers, going to the Final Four and making it to the WNBA. And then after a playing career was over, getting into coaching, and then going from coaching to being athletic director. And it was just so many things that I wasn't aware of. Like the fact that she actually originally committed to South Carolina. I didn't know that at all. And just talking about the recruiting process is very interesting. Then got to give a shout out to my man Carlos Bilal. He's he's born in Columbia, but he's put his feet down in Charleston. He's a local artist. Got a piece of art from him, and I was like, man, I gotta have him on the podcast. And he has such a fascinating story. Just what you see from him on IG is just like, that's on the surface. It gets like his father getting murdered and joining the military and moving from place to place, and settling into Charleston and getting his start with art, drawing in elementary school and trading his drawings for money and for lunch, and him figuring out at an early age that he could use art as a bartering tool. Really, 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 really good episode. Then had a special Hurricane Hugo episode. Had my dog Gerard Droz and Terrence Elmore, and we talked about what our experiences were, before, during, and after the hurricane, and just bringing up so many memories. Bringing up how the neighborhood, just everything just smelled like pine because all of the pine trees were blown over. Man, great episode. And then had Terrence Elmore back on the following episode because he's also a poet. And we talked about his writing process and getting encouragement from his wife and from other poets to continue to pursue this art. And he just recently put out a book called Pain Is Not Our Only Language. Make sure y'all pick that up. Looking forward to actually meeting him for the first time in real life at his book signing he's doing in February. Then my man LB, Leonard Brothers. Big shout out to him, my other fellow Tar Heel brother in Christ. We talked about him growing up in Connecticut and how he has family he grew up in Connecticut, but his family is rooted in North Carolina, and how that helped him shape his decision towards rooting for the Tar Heels. And had the good brother 12 Kyle back on the podcast on Since We Last Spoke instead of At the Plate. And I wanted to dedicate this episode to the year 1996. So we talked about like major events in news and sports and what was going on in our personal lives. Now, we covered Pac's death. We covered the Bulls winning the championship. We covered Tickle Me Elmo. Like all the key events that happened in 1996. We covered that. And then I had my LA sister in Charmaine. And that was one of my favorite episodes because we talked about her growing up in England and then moving to LA and what that adjustment was like for her. And then her rooting for the Lakers and eventually landing a job with the Lakers. And it's a testament to shooting your shot. And if you really want something, pursue that dream, because that was her dream. And now she's living that dream, working for her favorite team. So shout out to Charmaine. Then the next guest, Joseph Johnson. This is arguably my favorite episode that I've done. How this man grew up in Jacksonville, got caught up in the wrong crowd, got tried and convicted, and ended up doing a 10-year prison sentence. And how his time in prison, he started reading books and talked about how that reading books in prison changed his mindset, and talked about his first day out and what that adjustment was like getting back into the civilian world, and then pivoting and getting into the HVAC world, and how he met his wife and how that business has become a very lucrative business for him. Honestly, that's probably my favorite episode that I've done. Then the next episode, I had my dog DJ Illadell, Chucktown's favorite DJ. Had him on, talked about what it was like growing up in Chucktown and how we got into DJing and auditioning for OG Ron C and landing the spot with the Chop Stars, and how he became a fan of basically all Georgia teams except for the Phoenix Suns and the Duke Blue Devils. Great episode. Then another one of my favorite episodes was with my homie Jay Full. We talked for almost 3 hours. I had to split it up into 3 different episodes because that man has been through some things. Growing up in Atlanta, abusive parents, talking about having an abusive mother who was addicted to crack, and bouncing around from school to school in Atlanta, and getting into Duke, and then going from Duke to doing post-grad at Cornell, then Wake Forest, moving to Vegas, realizing that he had bipolar disorder, moving to LA. And with this episode, this also checked off something that I wanted to talk about, because I already had a previous episode talking about anxiety, but I wanted to get into some other mental illnesses, such as bipolar disorder, and talking about what it's like when you have manic episodes. And he said with his manic episodes, he was just always making impulse buys with his manic episodes, and talking about how he realized that was one of his triggers, and how he works on those triggers in those manic episodes. I highly recommend it. It's the autobiography of Jay Full. It's a 3-part episode. And then finally had my sister on as a guest. I went up to Memphis with my family and spent Thanksgiving with her, and actually got to record on the road, so to speak. We recorded it at her house, and we just talked about childhood stories and things that I didn't know from about her that I discovered on the podcast. And of course, my man Dewan, my other Tar Heel brother in Christ. We talked about growing up, what it was like growing up in Durham for him, and his love for the Charlotte Hornets and moving to the DMV, and how he got into the finance world. And then the icing on the cake was the Since We Last Spoke 2023 year in review episode with the aforementioned Bridget and Nick Jew, and talked about the Smokey Robinson album, talking about the Alabama folding chair incident, and a whole bunch of other things, just to recap what went on in the year 2023. And I failed to mention, but another one of my favorite episodes, which is also by far my most downloaded episode and the most viewed episode on my YouTube channel, was my Firestarter appreciation episode. Firestarter podcast is my favorite podcast ever. Well, right next to Combat Jack. And I always wanted to do an appreciation episode for them. So I reached out to a bunch of fellow fans of the podcast, and I was like, would you be interested? I put it out there on Twitter, like I want to do this Firestarter appreciation episode. Just hit me up in the DM with your email address if you want in on this episode. And golly, that episode ended up being like nine people that were on the episode with me, and it was so much fun talking about our favorite moments and like our favorite things from that podcast. That they started back in like 2011, so they've been going, gosh, like 13 years strong. And it felt good to be able to give them their flowers. And the fact that I was actually able to get Rod from the Black Guy Who Tips to be a guest on the podcast too, that meant a hell of a lot to me. So yeah, I just had to show love to all of my guests, because I couldn't have done this all by myself. And it was, again, I'm always interested in hearing somebody else's perspective and like what makes them tick, and what caused them to make the decisions that they made. And thank y'all so much from the bottom of my heart for the guests, and also to you, the listener, because I mean, you encourage me, you also give me positive feedback, and you give me constructive criticism too, which I greatly enjoy, because the goal isn't to get, I don't focus on the numbers. I simply focus on trying to improve the pod. So I'm going to keep continuing to improve the pod in 2024. So thank y'all so much. I love y'all from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for your listening ears and your watching eyes. And make sure that you go to my YouTube channel. You can subscribe at Danny Foxworth 843. You can find all of the video versions of all the podcast episodes on there. And till next time, I love y'all. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Y'all be good. See y'all in 2024. Got new episodes coming. Peace.